What I'm going to do is introduce Heidegger's philosophy of technology. Now, I had assumed you'd all have struggled with the text, but apparently that isn't true. So this will be an introduction to the text, and I'm hoping that this will inspire you all to rush out and buy Heidegger's book, The Question Concerning Technology, in which is his famous essay called The Question Concerning Technology. It is the most important text in the history of philosophy of technology. So if you're at all interested in philosophical understanding of the technological world that we live in, this might be a good place to look. Not that it is the final solution or answer to the question concerning technology, but at least it raises the question. And that's, it raises it in a particularly deep and puzzling way. Heidegger is a critic of technology, so he's often considered a technophobe, and there's some truth to that. I mean, he's famous, for example, for having complained to his students in one lecture about the typewriter alienating the hand from the word. He didn't like the power generating station on the Rhine, the hydroelectric generating station, as he criticizes it. But these are superficial aspects of his critique. They point to a kind of romantic nostalgia for an earlier time when there were no TV antennas on the roofs of Black Forest peasants' houses. But if you just see that aspect of his critique, you're missing what is really interesting in it. There's a deeper question which Heidegger is posing, and that has to do with the nature of meaning, of what we think of as the meaning of things, the meaning of life, meaning in general. What is meaning? And how is it affected by the rise of technology? And that's the more fundamental question that Heidegger is posing. Now, I know it sounds a little strange, because we take meaning for granted. I mean, this is a table. What's puzzling about that? But of course, it isn't a table in the sense, any sense that physics or chemistry or geology could discover. So what makes it a table, as opposed to certain, materials that have been assembled in a certain form? Why do we call it a table? Same with the chair you're sitting on. What is it about it that makes it a chair and not just a piece of plastic bent into an odd shape and glued to some metal bars? And our standard answer to this would be culture. But we'll see that it gets more complicated when we go more deeply into the question of meaning. What is disturbing for Heidegger is that with the technological age in which we live, meaning is undermined in fundamental ways. And this is really more important for him than the practical questions that you might ask about technology today, such as, will nuclear weapons blow us all up? Or will climate change turn Vancouver into a desert? These questions are, of course, of some interest to us, but they were not of great interest to Heidegger. He was focused on this other question of meaning, which he considered to be what he called an ontological question, that's to say, a question about the nature of being. Okay, well, there's another preliminary matter to go through before I try and explain his theory, and that's his politics. How many of you have heard of Heidegger before? How many of you have heard of his politics? Yeah, it seems to go with the territory, huh? Because it is so shocking. In 1933, Heidegger, who was a professor at the University of Freiburg, and quite well known at the time, declared himself a member of the Nazi Party and was immediately appointed rector of the university. And then he proposed a reform program that was going to Nazify the university. He lasted in this job a lot less time than the rectors of our universities here in Vancouver in recent years. I think he lasted 9 months or so before the Minister of Education concluded that his Nazism was purely personal. In other words, so idiosyncratic that it really didn't qualify him for the job, and he had to resign. And So it raises real serious questions. I mean, do we want to study a guy who could make such a political mistake? What does it mean about his philosophy? And there are different answers to that question. Some people say, well, it's just Nazi philosophy. It just took a while for him to notice. But I don't think that's correct. And if we look at his rationale for what he did, we'll see that it's somewhat different from what we normally think of as Nazism, and doesn't really fit with the regime that he ended up supporting, which is why they were right to kick him out. So what was his basic idea? Well, he saw the rise of technology in America and Russia as transforming civilization, creating a wholly new kind of civilization based on power, on simple power over nature and over other human beings. Europe, he believed, could save the day by preserving the spiritual acquisition of humanity over the last few thousand years since the ancient Greeks. But for Europe to save the day, it would have to assert itself historically against Russia and America. And guess who offered the program under which you could do this? Hitler appeared as a possibility to Heidegger because he would bring Germany back from its humiliation after World War I, make it again a great power, and enable it to affirm spirit against technology. Several texts, there's very few texts, but there's several texts which give some idea of how Heidegger was thinking about Nazism. In the Introduction to Metaphysics in 1935, there's a little interpolated passage where he talks about, quote, the inner truth and greatness of National Socialism, namely the encounter between global technology and modern man, end quote. Somehow Hitler was going to enable modern man to encounter global technology in the right spirit and overtake its devastating effects on meaning. By the mid-30s, Heidegger was already beginning to have his doubts about the Nazis, and even though he recognized them as trying to do the right thing, he wasn't sure they had the means to do it, and he became more and more skeptical, and he finally ended up, after World War II, expressing a completely different approach. No longer was he talking about Europe asserting itself against the technological giants to east and west, but rather he called for detachment and resignation in the face of the triumph of technology. He emphasized the givenness of being rather than the active attempt to direct and control it. His philosophy became a critical philosophy of technology in the aftermath of World War II. He saw technology as the essence of the modern age generally. He didn't make exceptions for Germany anymore. And he called on people to think. Thinking was his solution now. Thinking meaning not just planning the next step in the technological conquest of the world, but reflecting on the meaning of things and the meaning of life. He came up finally with the notion of what he called a free relation to technology. And this would be a way of living with technology without being technologized. Here's another quote from his later work. He says, we can say yes to the unavoidable use of technological objects, and we can at the same time say no insofar as we do not permit them to claim us exclusively and thus to warp, confuse, and finally lay waste to our essence. So what's he really calling for here? Some kind of changed attitude, right, that would allow us to drive to work without identifying with technology at our deepest level and being distorted by that identification. It reduces, in my opinion, to a change in attitude. And I'm skeptical that this is a good solution to the problem of technology. But this is where Heidegger ended up once he gave up on a political solution, which for him was identified with the Nazi regime that had failed. The strangest thing about Heidegger's Nazism is that even though he realized that he'd made a mistake in endorsing Hitler, he never publicly excused himself. Many other scholars in Germany did, but not Heidegger. And he claimed that this was because it looked to him hypocritical. You can really wonder about the character of the guy, not only because he wanted to be a Nazi at one point, but also because he couldn't figure out what was more important, you know, avoiding the appearance of hypocrisy or admitting his errors publicly. It's very strange. But in fact, I'm not sure that he ever really understood what had gone wrong. He gave an interview in 1966 to the German magazine Der Spiegel, in which he expressed kind of his last reflections. He asked that it be published after his death. And in that interview, he said, "I see the task of thought to consist in helping man in general, within the limits allotted to thought, to achieve an adequate relationship to the essence of technology. National Socialism, to be sure, moved in this direction, but those people were far too limited in their thinking to acquire an explicit relationship to what is happening today and what has been underway for 3 centuries. So that was Hitler's problem. He was just too limited. So, I mean, this really calls into question Heidegger's character. How deeply does it affect our appreciation of his thought? That's the more fundamental question. I mean, we can dismiss him as a certain kind of person we probably wouldn't want to have lunch with. But does that mean that his thought is irredeemably tainted by this association? And you have to confront this question. There's no escaping it. What I think that it's not possible to identify Heidegger's thought with his politics, that there's a big gap between them. And I base this on several considerations. This is why I'm able to give you a talk on Heidegger's philosophy of technology rather than just saying, oh, don't read Heidegger, he was a Nazi. First of all, he had 4 Jewish students. Hannah Arendt, Herbert Marcuse, Hans Jonas, and Karl Löwit. All 4 became famous social philosophers in later years. And they're still read. Not one of them noticed Heidegger's Nazism before he announced it. So they went to his classes, they associated with him and talked to him, and they somehow had no suspicion that he was a Nazi, and they've been reading his works. In fact, Marcuse actually wrote down, he transcribed Heidegger's lectures as he spoke, and these transcriptions are to be found in the archives in Frankfurt. So they had the most intimate acquaintance with his thought that you could imagine, and yet they didn't notice that he was a Nazi. So how could he be fundamentally a Nazi? You understand the problem? Surely they would have noticed if it was really essential to his way of thinking. It's still puzzling. He thought he was a Nazi. I mean, if he thought so, surely there's some connection. But the way I think about this is in terms of the inherent ambiguity of philosophy. Now think about this. If I start talking to you about the essence of things, the nature of meaning, being, and so these are extremely abstract terms. If I want to translate a discourse at that level of abstraction into, say, advice to you about how to live your life, I'm going to have to come back down to earth. And in coming down to earth, I have to fill in the almost empty concepts I'm using, right? What's the meaning of life? Well, you know, some people say it's love. Some people say it's work. I mean, but we have to fill in the empty concept, or nearly empty concept, right? Which is a kind of abstraction or euphemization of everyday things that we are able to put our hands on and get a grasp of. That gap is the space within which Heidegger's thought could be concretized in very different ways. He chose to concretize it through his understanding, his flawed understanding of Nazism. But that wasn't the only way to concretize it. Marcuse, who was his student and his assistant at the same time as Heidegger was working out this Nazi thing, concretized Heidegger's thought as in terms of Marxism, as a doctrine of revolution. And I'm sure there are other experiments made in concretizing Heidegger by Hannah Arendt, for example. So the level of abstraction of philosophy permits different politics to emerge. The fact that Heidegger chose the politics he chose is a sign that his thought is perhaps has some significant openings to a very conservative political stance. In any case, the conclusion I reach is that we can learn from Heidegger. We just have to be aware of this background and be careful in studying him where we see signs of something going seriously wrong. Okay, so that's a first round of considerations on Heidegger. But now I want to turn to something quite different. I want to try and give you, in more down-to-earth, common-sense, sociological terms, a framework within which to think about what's going on in his philosophy of technology. I'm going to do this before talking about the philosophy of technology, because here we're going to be at a sort of a second level of concretion, right? But one which is also more familiar to us than the very abstract vocabulary that he uses. So the way to do this is to talk about the relation of culture to technology and craft. Heidegger, the most fundamental assumption Heidegger makes is that our relation to reality is a practical relation. It's a relation that involves doing things, making things. And this is true of the human being in general. This is how we have a world for Heidegger. We don't have a world by observing through our eyes from the distance of an abstract stance as knowers. We have a world through moving among things that make sense to us. And we enter the room and we see that there are chairs and tables, and we place ourselves with respect to the room. We do all these things almost automatically, but they reflect our ability to cope with a world that has some sort of order, meaning, sense, right, that makes sense to us, that we can understand. This is the way in which we are in touch with reality for Heidegger. And he wants to explain it in relation first to the philosophies that reflect this in a craft society, and then the philosophies and practices that reflect it in a technological society. So I'm going to introduce the concept of culture here, which he would probably reject. Culture didn't work for Heidegger because it seems too subjectivistic. There are complicated reasons, which I won't go into unless you ask me why he didn't like the concept of culture. But we all understand this concept, so it's good for us to use it to get a first approach to what Heidegger is doing. Well, what is culture? Culture is what we take for nature. It's what seems obvious and self-evident. We don't question it. There's no big debate about tables and chairs, right? We debate other things. They're not part of the culture. For example, should we invade Mali in order to eliminate the Islamist threat? We can debate that all we want. It's not part of the culture, right? But what is undebatable, what's self-evident, is culturally secured. Now, the culture is in the background of all of our technical making. Why? Because it organizes our activity, right? It gives meaning to things, to our own actions, and it organizes us in relation to reality. In craft societies, in earlier pre-modern societies, the technical making goes on through craft. And craft is an activity that looks a little bit like technology, but it's profoundly different. Both technology and craft make things, but with craft, the making is part of the general social process. It's small scale, and it doesn't involve scientific knowledge. So these three things make it very different from modern technology, which is separated from the general social life, right, in special places where technologies are designed and produced, and it's large scale, and it's based on scientific knowledge. So there's a big difference here between the way in which reality is given to pre-modern societies based on craft and the way it's given to us. In sociology, there's a term that's used to talk about this difference, and the term is differentiation, the differentiation of society. By this, it's meant that social institutions get separate organization and status. I mean, in the Middle Ages, you inherited your job, right? Whether it was being a farmer or being a judge or being king. In a modern society, offices and persons are differentiated in the sense that you can't inherit your job any longer. That's a personal thing, inheritance, whereas the job is a function based presumably on merit, right? And so you have to qualify for the job through credentials or whatever. And this is a differentiation of two things that were condensed in the Middle Ages. The differentiation of politics and religion is a fundamental feature of modern societies. And technology is differentiated also. And here you can see more clearly the difference with craft. Craft activity is based on technical know-how, rules of thumb about how to make things properly. It's based on aesthetic considerations about how things should look when they're made. There are ethical rules governing what you can and can't make and do. And all of these things are merged together in a single activity, the craft activity. Presumably, if you ask the craftsman, you ask the shoemaker in the Middle Ages or the guy who makes the sword or whatever, if you ask them about purely technical matters, they can answer in purely technical terms. But that's not the way they understand what they're doing. Right? The maker of the samurai sword is instilling a certain spirit through certain practices, rituals, and so on in the object, but he knows all about how to make a sharp blade, too. If you want to know about that, he can tell you that. But it's one process, whereas in modern societies, these processes get separated. This is differentiation, right? And from it emerges technology as we understand it. Ethical and aesthetic considerations are not part of the engineering school's curriculum. Sorry, they don't fit with the concept of professional engineering. Now, there might be a class in engineering ethics that students are forced to take, but I'm sure they do their best to ignore it. It doesn't really fit the picture. So what we end up with is what we think of as technology today, a pure means to undetermined ends. We think of technology as value neutral. It's just there for whatever end we choose to use it for. But of course, it's not quite true. Even though it's been differentiated from ethics and aesthetics, it still is culturally marked. It still has cultural significance. It's significant that we see it as value neutral. That in itself is its biggest cultural feature. I mean, think about the difference between the technology that's fully integrated to the social life of the society and one that is seen as external to its social life, as simply a means that's brought in when it's needed for this or that end. That difference is itself a cultural difference, right, between a pre-modern and a modern culture. It's necessary for technology in our society to operate like that so that it can be wielded by organizations like corporations and governments, which have rapidly changing objectives. Okay? Corporations are changing the goals for which they're using technology all the time as they decide on, this is a market that's opening up, that's one that's closing down, and taste is changing. So there's an organization. Our society is built around organizations, and organizations have a kind of flexible relation to goals and meanings. They're constantly shifting their purposes. Now, so technology and organizations fit together as the infrastructure of modern societies. Now, this is really basically where Heidegger enters the picture. This is what he doesn't like. This is what he's critical of. this value-neutral, supposedly value-neutral technology that's wielded by organizations that themselves have no permanent commitments or goals, but shifting patterns of goals, goal patterns from one time to another. This creates a world in which there are no stable meanings. Meanings are in flux, and they appear to be humanly created. Think about advertising, right, which is a process of signifying things. Meanings become flexible tools for manipulating people, controlling their behavior, selling goods, instead of being stable features of social life that undergird all the other activities. In a sense, culture becomes itself a tool, right, to the extent that it can be mastered and controlled by organizations. And this creates a world unlike any earlier social world that has existed in the history of the human beings. Now, normally, social criticism of technology is not like this. Normally, what we think of is, well, these people are, with the oil sands, they're putting out a lot of climate changing pollution, and this is bad, and we would like them to stop doing this, either improve the process or stop. You know, we have specific objectives of some sort that concern us in our normal, everyday criticisms of technology, pollution or whatever. But that's not the level at which Heidegger is approaching this. He's approaching it at the level of the form of our civilization. What kind of a civilization do we live in? And that, regardless of whether the oil sands are polluting or non-polluting, or whether the internet is a space of free communication or just a delivery mechanism for TV crap, doesn't matter. It's still a type of civilization in which people can make such choices. And that in itself is bizarre. When you think about it, it's strange. There's no earlier social form in which people could make these kinds of choices. They couldn't decide the meaning of things. They were given the meaning of things by their tradition, by the way they grew up. And these meanings were stable and evolved, of course, but very slowly, so invisibly. And we have this weird new kind of society in which nothing is fixed and stable. But this threatens us. This is a function of differentiation, right? This is a result of the differentiation of society and the emergence of technology as a distinctive way of encountering reality. So what is the ultimate problem then? For Heidegger, it is the collapse of the very idea of meaning. If meanings become simply tools to manipulate people with, you can see through them, right? You can cease to be available for this kind of manipulation. Meanings, in effect, are no longer what we normally would think of as meanings. Remember, culture is what cannot be questioned. Well, if it's just something designed in an office somewhere, then it can be questioned. You know, there are actually consultants who are called in to construct the culture of new factories, things like that. I mean, just the idea of being a cultural consultant is so strange. If it's culture, it shouldn't be the object of a technological decision-making process, right? It should just be. And it is given to us. We don't make it. It's given to us and becomes the basis of our lives. But meaning is being destroyed by this reorganization of technological this organization of a technological civilization. So this is the nature of a radical critique of technology progress. Now it raises some questions which I won't answer, but I'll just pose them here so you have them in mind when I talk about the text itself. We can ask what it is about differentiated technology that leads to disaster, right? Exactly how does it work to undermine fundamental requirements of a decent civilization? We can also ask whether a total critique of the sort that Heidegger puts forward is going to be regressive. I mean, could it be that the only alternative to the kind of society that he's condemning is a return to the Middle Ages? That doesn't sound attractive. But what's the way forward? He doesn't have a very clear idea. So that raises the question of whether there's any hope or whether we're headed toward a kind of brave new world, right? in which everything is simply an object of manipulation, including people. And we can also ask a more sort of technically interesting question, philosophically technically interesting question. Is there some connection, can we build some connection, which Heidegger didn't do, between specific types of critiques, for example, critique of environmental pollution, and the global critique of a technological civilization? Is there some way of making a link there that would enable us to have a politics of technology? If not, then is there any real reason to, is there any real hope left for us? Okay, so I've explained these concepts. This is not exactly an explanation of Heidegger. It's sort of tangential to Heidegger, but it's supposed to make it now possible to understand the explanation of Heidegger's theory, which is couched in different language, but it is really about the sort of things that I've just been talking about. Okay, so to understand Heidegger's critique of technology in the famous essay, The Question Concerning Technology, you have to know that it's part of a larger project that he was engaged in. He called this project the history of being. Now, by being, he doesn't mean existence. The history of existing things might be, cosmology, Darwinian evolution, whatever. He's not interested in that. By being, he really means the system of meanings through which we have a world. It's a puzzling concept, use of words, right? But this is the use of words that was current in Germany around before World War I, which he picked up. And very roughly, by being, he means the system of meanings that constitute a world for us. Something that we would probably call culture today. The history of being, then, is the history of the types of meanings that have prevailed. In Heidegger's case, since the ancient Greeks, that's where he starts his history of being. And there are a series of epical dispensations that define the world for different stages in the development of the meaning of being. And he starts with an original dispensation, which is the founding of Western culture, with the pre-Socratic philosophers. Well, Heidegger's interpretation of the pre-Socratics is rather idiosyncratic. It's an unusual interpretation. But basically, he argues that they believed that existing and meaning were one and the same thing, that things came into being, they brought themselves into being by a kind of dynamic in which they gave themselves existence in the world and also a meaning. He called this a revealing, a kind of self-revealing of being. This idea is so abstract it hardly makes sense, but if you think about it in terms of the craft world of the time, you can make some sense out of it. What's going on with craft? Well, people are making things, they're taking materials and giving those materials a form of some sort, and that form corresponds to the meaning the materials are supposed to have. The shoe is made to be a shoe. It's not just assembled pieces of leather, right? It's a shoe. So in the making of the thing, it takes on not only physical existence, but also meaning. Where this differs from nature is simply in the fact that a human being has to be around to help out. Nature makes itself, but artifacts are made through the cooperation of human beings. The Greek notion of craft becomes the inspiration for Aristotle's famous concept of causality. In Aristotle's metaphysics, he distinguishes four causes, what we call causes. Well, Heidegger will contest the translation. There's the final, formal, material, and efficient cause. This is Aristotle. And this is an articulation in philosophy of this original dispensation of meaning to the Greeks. Okay? What are these causes? Final cause is the purpose. The formal cause is the shape. The material cause is the materials of which the thing is made. And the efficient cause is the making process, right? Which involves, in the case of nature, some inner core that pushes development forward. In the case of artifacts, the intervention of a craftsman. The usual translation of efficient cause is as cause in the sense of the maker in our modern sense of the term, the person who does the work and makes it happen. But Heidegger contests this. He says, in the Greek concept of craft, as reflected in this philosophical notion of causality, the maker is really not making the thing. He's gathering the other elements together so that the thing emerges out of itself to the extent that it can, right, with a little help, a little push from human beings. This is a very strange idea. He completely rejects the notion, the modern idea of causality, in which the cause is always the thing which makes it happen, right? Here, it's just the cause is just a cooperating element that brings together the materials with an idea of form and a purpose. And by bringing those things together, something is made. There's a famous story about Michelangelo that gives an illustration of this idea of craft. When Michelangelo was asked how he was going to turn this big block of marble into his statue of David, how had he done that? He answered, well, I just cut away everything that wasn't David, right? So it's as though the statue was waiting to be revealed, right? To be let out of the block of marble. Heidegger at one point says, when the potter works the clay, he gives it form, but more significantly, he removes its formlessness. Okay? So, by reversing the terms in this way, he's indicating that the pot is waiting to be released from the formlessness of the clay. And the potter doesn't make it in our sense, he just helps the pot come out of the clay. The world is teleological in this ancient concept, right? It has purpose in itself. The purposes are not up here in our heads. They're in the things themselves. The purpose is in the marble. It's in the clay, just waiting to be released in the case of artifacts. Of course, in the case of natural entities, there's no need for our help. They make themselves. They have their own inner purpose, and it drives them forward to whatever is their destined form, whereas we have to help artifacts. So this is Heidegger's analysis then of the original origins of the history of being in ancient Greece. So what has happened in modern times? He uses this discussion of ancient technology, right, ancient craft, as a contrast class, right, for modern technology. It's going to help us understand what's different about modern technology. The original meaning degenerates. We've already suggested that cause changes in meaning, right, from Aristotle's interpretation of it as a gathering process to our modern view of it as making something according to a plan, an arbitrary plan. I won't go through the different degenerations, but he has a whole list of them. Ways in which first through the translation of Greek into Latin, and then the emergence of modern science, the original dispensation is distorted and lost. We finally end up with a notion of being as simply raw materials, just there without any meaning, without any content of its own, just there to be manipulated and controlled by human beings. Aristotle introduced the notion of essence to describe the unified meaning of things, right? The essence describes their form, their purpose, their matter, right? All in one concept. Essences are eliminated in modern science, and what's left are the manipulable aspects of things. So things are reduced finally to technological raw materials, the world becomes a collection of system components and raw materials. And Heidegger calls this enframing. It's the modern scientific technical reason is based on this enframing of reality. It's reduction to simple raw materials. Heidegger argues that in this sense, science is always already technological, because it treats the world as the sort of thing that can be controlled and manipulated. So technology is more fundamental than science. Technology is not applied science. In a sense, it's the other way around. Science is applied technology. It's what the world becomes once it has been treated as simply the object of control and planning by human beings. Well, so far, I mean, when Descartes thought this up, or Bacon, or other early thinkers, 17th, 18th century thinkers, they envisaged human beings controlling natural processes through understanding science and technology, and thereby eliminating poverty and suffering and war and creating a better world. So the puzzle for Heidegger, and actually for a lot of 20th century thought, is why it hasn't worked that way. Why didn't that happen? Why did we get, instead of this better world where everyone was prosperous and happy, a kind of utopia, why did we get World War I? Why did we get chemical warfare and eventually atomic warfare and concentration camps and all kinds of distressing horrors? Why did we get a meaningless world where nothing any longer seems to be important or significant, ultimately? Why did this happen? And Heidegger's answer is, it's because the enframing does not stop short of human beings. It incorporates them into the technology, into the raw materials, into the system components. Human beings, too, are enframed. They become just another mechanical part in the system. How true it is, right? I just took an airplane. When you take an airplane, you are simply a system component. And if you don't act like a system component, you get kicked off the flight. Right? The hostesses, the pilots, everybody is a component in a system that surpasses them and that controls all their behavior. So ultimately, you're not very different from a gear, or a panel or a seat. Right? You're just part of the system. And this systematization of human activity goes far, because it's not just when you're on the airplane, right? It's everywhere in social life. People's activity is structured by technical systems, and they function in those systems as components. This is the enframing of the human being, right? Which begins to sound a little more threatening than Descartes' example of the wax. If we are just extended matter, then there's a problem with this whole scheme. There's another kind of evidence for this, which is more contemporary. You go into a bookstore, and you can find operating manuals for your computer, for your automobile, and for your life. There's a whole collection, right? How to get divorced, how to get married, how to raise children, how to diet. I mean, in all of these operating manuals, you are a constructed technical object, right? And you're supposed to use the 10 bullets at the end of each chapter, right, to figure out how to do it right. So you optimize your chances in life. But it's a perfectly technical model, right, of how to relate to yourself. So your self-relation becomes that, very similar to your relation to your computer. Only instead of, typing on the keyboard, you do something in the kitchen, right? Or you make an appointment for your kid or whatever. But it's the same mentality. Yeah. Well, that's right. In business, we have human resources. And so the reduction of the human being to simply another cog in the mechanism is, for Heidegger, catastrophic. He has a specific reason for worrying about this. He's not concerned about human dignity in the usual sense of the term. And in fact, I'm not sure that dignity is really at stake in being a system component in the airline industry. You know, I mean, the main point is just to get there, right? But there's something else involved. All through this history of being that Heidegger has been describing, he's been interested in the fact that the world is, as he puts it, revealed to human beings. The world is not simply there. Now, of course, there's a sense in which nature is simply there. I mean, Heidegger doesn't doubt that there were dinosaurs and so on, long before we were on the earth. That's not an interesting problem for him. If there were no human beings to interpret the meaning of the concept of dinosaur, there might have been something there, but, you know, what are you going to say about it, right? If you once abstract from any kind of human connection, then there's nothing to be said. Because, of course, a concept like dinosaur is part of a system of meanings that we participate in creating. It's not arbitrary, right? It's not like a personal, like a poem that I might write. It emerges from some kind of interaction between us and reality, but it involves us essentially. So what Heidegger calls a revealing is the construction of a meaningful world through some kind of interaction that's not specifiable really. He can't really say what it is, but it's some kind of interaction between us and being, right? What's out there. Up until now, human beings have taken for objectively real all these meanings that they are participating in constructing. They've simply seen them as out there, the same way we see dinosaurs as out there, right, before we were around. In the process, they really misunderstood the nature of revealings, the nature of meaning. However, they at least didn't incorporate themselves into the world of things that were controlled technically. Craftsmen made shoes. They didn't make people, right? So the world is revealed through some kind of technical relation to reality. That's how ultimately we get in touch with the real world, through doing things, through making things, through controlling our passage through life. And out of this process comes an ordered system of meanings we call a world, and in it people have a special status. They are, maybe in medieval cosmology, right, they're at the center of the universe, and God is interested in them in a different way than he's interested in, you know, blades of grass or rocks. So the idea that human beings are somehow special is preserved, even though there's a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of meaning. In modern societies, the special status of human beings disappears as they become just another raw material or system component. And that's where the real threat lies. This threat is fully actualized and described by Aldous Huxley in 1931 in Brave New World. Right? Have you ever read Brave New World? In Brave New World, people are system components down to the core, right? They've even been produced in a factory. The old artisanal methods have been abandoned, right? And now people come out of bottles, and they have intelligence adjusted to their place in the division of labor, and so everything they believe was constructed by advertising agents and pounded into their head by hypnopedia while they slept. So all meanings are completely artificial programs designed to control them, right? So Brave New World is really a picture of what happens when you extrapolate to the limit the tendencies Heidegger is criticizing in modern civilization. Now, there's a turning point in Heidegger's essay. There's a strange turning point, which I want to talk about in conclusion. Since you haven't read it, there's not much point in telling you the page number, but you will eventually read it, I'm sure. And you'll find at the bottom of page 27 the following passage. Heidegger says, the enframing not only conceals a former way of revealing, the old ancient Greek way, a former way of bringing forth, but it conceals revealing itself, and with it that wherein unconcealment, that is truth, comes to pass. So what he's saying here is that the modern enframing blocks our understanding, our awareness of revealing as it was given to the Greeks, but it not only does that, it conceals revealing itself. That is to say, it makes it impossible for us to understand that there is a world out there that consists of a system of meanings. We instead think of ourselves as relating to merely existing things that have no meaning, that are just, natural objects as science describes them, and meanings are just in our head somehow, projected out there. And and this, he says, is this occlusion of the process of revealing itself, the reduction of all experience to a merely subjective relation to natural scientific nature, right? This is a catastrophe. He says it prevents truth from coming to pass, the event of truth being an experience of knowing the meaning of things. So Heidegger goes on. He says on the next page, the threat to man does not come in the first instance from the potentially lethal machines and apparatus of technology. The actual threat has already affected man in his essence. The rule of enframing threatens man with the possibility that it could be denied him to enter into a more original revealing, and hence to experience the call of a more primal truth. Here what he's saying is, we are losing any ability to reveal a world. Eventually, at the furthest end of the extrapolation, people become robots. So the problem isn't that we might make robots that were smarter and more powerful than us. The problem is that we might become essentially the equivalent of robots, just responding reflexively to stimuli of one sort or another that have been organized and provided by the social machinery. This is what's happening. We have already been affected in our essence. The rule of enframing threatens man with the possibility that it could be denied him to enter into a more original revealing. In other words, there must be in the history of being, there must be some phase that follows this technological age. But we could be prevented from entering this final phase or this next phase by being reduced to this robotic existence. And then comes a strange turning point. There's never really been clear understanding by critics of exactly what he's saying here. He says, thus, where enframing reigns, there is danger in the highest sense. And then he quotes Hölderlin, German poet who he loves. But where danger is, grows the saving power also. Now, what is the saving power? Suddenly, everything is turned upside down, right? We're about to turn into robots in Brave New World, and suddenly the saving power emerges out of this ultimate catastrophe, the destruction of the human essence. Then there follow several pages in which he just gets us more confused. But what he seems to be getting at is that somehow what has happened with technology is that we've been enabled to think the notion of meaning in a new way. Even as it destroys meaning, it thematizes meaning, right? It brings meaning to our attention in a new way. He says on page 30, it is technology itself that makes the demand on us to think in another way what is usually understood by essence. Essence being another term for meaning. So now this is an interesting turning point in the essay. Somehow, the fact that meaning has been so utterly devalued and destroyed forces us to think about meaning in a new way. Our modern view destroys meaning, but it reveals to us that we are involved in meaning. So what is revealed by the same process that is destroying meaning and reducing man to a robot is also revealing the fact of revealing. It's making it possible for us to think our status as engaged in some kind of interaction out of which meaning arises. This is what Heidegger calls the needed, man's needed belonging to being. Right? Being needs us. Meaning needs us. The exact way it needs us is not describable in terms of notions like plans or goals or subjective desires, whatever. Being needs us at some much more fundamental level out of which worlds emerge. And we can now understand that in a way that the Greeks could not, even though, and perhaps because our status as humans is threatened by technology. Take it one step further. Why? What's new about our situation? Well, what's new is that we can no longer believe that meanings are simply there. We can't believe that anymore because we know that we're involved somehow in the production of meaning. That's why we have concepts like culture, right, which are supposed to help us think about the variety of different ways human societies have given meaning to their environment. And we can think like that. There's a danger in thinking like that. The danger is that we devalue all meaning since it's all just subjective, right? On the other hand, there's a promise in that. The promise that we can start understanding meaning as a kind of interaction between us and the world. And that then promises a new age that would follow the technological age and enable us to live in that free relation to technology Heidegger mentioned in an earlier quotation at the beginning of this, that I gave you at the beginning of this talk. Well, the last pages of Heidegger's essay try and give us hints as to how we could break through to this new relation to technology as a new era in the history of being. He's against regression. He doesn't think we can go back. Even though he has this nostalgia for the old technologies, he doesn't think we can actually go back. We're stuck in with the technology of our time, but he doesn't think we can actively promote a new age. To do so would just be more technology. I mean, the whole problem of meaning is that it's not really meaning if you don't believe in it, and you can't believe in it if you make it. If you decide that, well, I would certainly be a happier, healthier person if I had a spiritual dimension to my life. So I'm going to, pick up on some religion. I've just turned the religion into another technology. It's the technology I use to have a happier life. So I have antacids for when I, eat too much pizza, and I have religion for when I feel down, and all these things work together. So here you understand the problem. It's not a meaning if you made it. It's only a meaning if it's given to you. It's somehow something that has its own kind of standing. It's not just a projection of your spirit, but it's something that you're engaged with that's out there. So an active attempt to create this new age in which the human role in revealing would be revealed would just be another technology and confine us once again to the present technological age. So he's not proposing a solution, because there really isn't any solution since it's not really a problem. You can make a distinction between predicaments and problems, right? Problems have solutions. Predicaments are just, there, and you're in it. And in this case, that's the technological age is a predicament, not a problem. So he hints at the possible power of art to take on such an importance in people's lives that it would again put them in connection to deeper meanings, meanings that are not just manipulable plans, but actually emerge from an encounter with reality. He hints at this, but he doesn't think that this is likely because art has just become another expression of the technological age. Art is And he's not worried so much about the fact that art is a way of making money, but more that the artistic production is no longer the expression of the community, but simply the individual subjectivity of the artist. He says perhaps the extremity of the disaster into which technology will bring us could lead to a revolution in the human spirit. But again, there's no way to predict that. So he's left at the end of the essay in a kind of nebulous state. And this shows up most clearly in that final interview, in the Spiegel interview, where the interviewer persistently asks him to offer some kind of solution, and he says, Heidegger says, only a God can save us. Right? A God meaning a change in the history of being, something entirely out of our control that could happen, but which we can't make happen. Okay, so it's difficult to imagine being a Heideggerian today, although actually I know some. I think the importance of all of this is that it forces us to view technology as a civilizational project and not simply as a set of means to ends which are self-evident, like having shelter and food and so on. We live within this project, and so it's invisible to us. Right? Culture is what you don't question. What is our culture ultimately? It is this technological dispensation within which we live and which is hidden to us by its very obviousness. And Heidegger helps us to overcome that obviousness and to think about this as this technological project as a civilizational choice of some sort that we're engaged in. And that's really essential to any kind of philosophy of technology that's going to go beyond journalism, a sort of triviality of most criticism of technology and address really fundamental questions. Okay, so that's probably enough, as much punishment as you can take.